Shrinking Violet by Cleve F. Adams, Clues Detective, July 1935, in which Violet McDade butts into somebody else's business. Violet McDade was throwing a party, and, like most of Violet's parties, this one boded ill for my peace of mind. We were due to dock at San Pedro in the morning. This was the last night of the cruise, the night traditionally set aside for the captain's ball, the night of all nights that Violet would pick to embarrass me. There were times when she infuriated me so that I could quite cheerfully have emptied my little 32 into her fat middle. But I never did. Cold logic always came to my rescue. As her partner, I was making more money than any dick, male or female, would risk losing. Besides, I liked the creature. There was a third reason, one that perhaps bore more weight than the other two combined. She was faster than a rattlesnake with those two sleeve guns of hers, and now she was sitting enthroned like an overstuffed Buddha in a corner of the main saloon, recounting to a delighted audience tales from her none-too-savory past. Captain Lowe was annoyed. Some of the snootier passengers were annoyed, but in view of the fact that Violet was a valuable patron of the line, there wasn't much that he, or they, could do about it. She was looking a little seedy, as she often did after one of her periodic voyages. She took to the sea, as some fat women do to a diet. Violet couldn't or wouldn't diet, but when her weight became oppressive, she climbed aboard a boat and stoically reduced by the seasick method. It never failed to take off 50 pounds or so. You've heard the old gag about falling away to a ton. Well, Violet was down to her normal 350, but the strenuous reducing process had left her skin a little loose around the edges. I looked at her and wished she'd get sick again. She had finished her circus career amid loud cheers from her listeners and was beginning an uncouth discourse on the ramifications of her detective agency when the girl edged into the group. It was as if she, the girl, were drawn there by some magnetic force, almost against her will. Studying her with some curiosity, I knew she was unused to this sort of thing. Violet herself didn't drink, or smoke either, but she was seeing that everyone else did. Violet had a propensity for entertaining lavishly. Stewards scurried about with trays, dispensing the best the bar afforded, and my partner airily signed the checks. The girl refused everything offered her, but still stayed on to drink in the great goof's words. After a time, Violet noticed her, pantomimed to me that something must be wrong. Her lips framed what I construed to be, "Bring the dame over." Inwardly seething, I did as directed. The girl's name was Joan Lefebvre, and she had come aboard at Papeete, way down in Tahiti. I remembered seeing her when she engaged passage, but ever since then she had kept to herself. She was evidently traveling alone, and for the first time. "What's the matter?" asked Violet. "Ain't them stewards got what you want?" "Hell's bells. This line's supposed to be famous for its now cuisine." I just don't care for anything," said the girl. Her smile was a little forced. Nice-looking thing she was. Tiny hands and feet, hair the color of corn silk, face tanned a rich golden brown. Her English was good, but slightly flavored with some accent. French, I presumed, seeing that Papeete is 50% French. But it was her eyes that got me sad. They were infinitely sad, and yet there was something else in their depths, something that spoke of indomitable willpower, a fixed purpose I couldn't fathom. Bashful she might be, unused to meeting strangers, but she was going somewhere and she meant to get there. I sickened of Violet's careless probing into the girl's affairs and went on deck for a breath of air. It was pretty late, and we had run into a coastal fog. The ship's horn blasted the stillness of the night at frequent intervals. Her giant searchlight strove ineffectually to pierce the murk, but she still ploughed on at full speed ahead. I hoped the officers on the bridge could see better than I could. The rail was wet, cold to my touch. Drifting fingers of fog curled about me as I stood there, but these things were fresh and clean after the stuffiness of the saloon. Violet found me after an hour or so. She had the girl Joan Lefebvre with her, and the three of us lingered there in the darkness, listening to the dreary moaning of the foghorn and the swish of water far below. Joan said, breathing deep, "It is nice, eh? So much nicer than 42, Violet chuckled, that great booming chuckle that was so characteristic of her. "So, you don't like my parties, huh? Well, I am not so hot about 'em myself. After I get 'em started, I get to feeling kinda cultish, and that's one way of relieving the strain." She sighed, and suddenly I was very sorry for her. "A woman cast in a man's mold," she sighed again. "'S like getting drunk, I guess." A man's hoarse shout shattered the night. "Sneer off, you fool." There followed a prolonged blast from the foghorn. Bells clanged. A tremendous shudder shook the whole ship. I waited, stark with paralyzing fear, for the impact that didn't come. Instead, voices from the bridge hurled imprecations at someone I could not see, and out of the fog, muffled yet quite distinct, came an answering hail. This new voice was powerful, blasphemous. It was flavored strongly with the same peculiar accent as Joan Lefebvre. It said, I can't repeat its most colorful phrases, but the meaning was cleared. One of the last things it said was, "Go to hell." A vague, blurred shape, as of some ghostly ship of yesteryear, floated by as we picked up speed. Violet roared with gargantuan mirth. She loved anything in the line of profanity, and then we saw the girl. She was slumped forward against the rail, pale as a sheet, and she was unconscious. "Fainted dead away," Violet grunted. "Damned if I know why, though." "She was all right till that crazy frog began cussing." "You suppose she," I said. "I've no idea. But speaking of ideas, it might be a good one to do something for her." Without a word, without seeming effort, Violet picked the child up, tucked her under an arm, and made for the nearest companionway. Did I say she was a child? I was wrong there. It was the girl's apparent helplessness, a total lack of sophistication that made her seem so. In reality, she was probably nearly as old as I. She was still out when we reached our suite. We laid her on the bed and I applied smelling salts, started to chafe her wrists. Violet disappeared in search of the ship's doctor. I thought she could have phoned, and why she didn't was beyond me, until later. Joan Lefebvre opened her eyes, stared at me uncomprehendingly for an instant. The fright in those eyes was unmistakable, though she tried to veil it with a wan smile. There was no collision, I reassured her. Again, I got the impression that it wasn't the impending accident which had caused her to faint. This was strengthened by her next query. Do you know who it was out there in the fog?" "No, my dear." "Only that it was someone with a rich vocabulary, someone aboard a sailing ship, I believe." Which innocent remark set her to trembling all over again. I soothed her as best I could, forced a little brandy between her lips. I wondered what the devil was keeping Violet, had just about made up my mind to call the doctor myself when she waddled in. "Doc's in your stateroom waiting for you, honey," she said. "So let's go bye-bye again." Once more she picked the girl up, looking strangely awkward as she did so, and yet uncommonly tender too for her. She rolled out of the room with her burden. When she came back a few moments later, she informed me that Joan was resting easily, that the doctor had administered a sedative. "Took you a long time to find him," I grumbled. She looked surprised. "Hell," she said. "I wasn't looking for the dead. I was searching her room. What in the world for?" "I never saw such a creature," snooping in the girl's business. Haven't you a spark of decency?" "Nope," said Violet, placidly, "but I sure do find things out. Looks like the kid has located some of this hidden treasure you hear about, or maybe she's just a plain thief. Anyway, she's got the craziest collection of money you ever saw. French, English, and good old USA. Old stuff, most of it. Smells like it'd been hidden away for years, and she's got a gun." "What of it? So have we, okay?" said Violet. She spread her fat, be-ringed hands in a gesture of resignation. "Okay, there ain't no mystery about her, and like you say, I guess it's none of my business anyway." She sank into a chair, raised thick ankles to the chaise longue. Weariness showed in every line of her broad face. Her little green eyes, embedded in rolls of fat, mirrored something that brought a lump to my throat. She should have been a man, but she wasn't. And, as a woman, "I know what you are going to say," she sighed. "Go on, tell me what an ass I made of myself." "Nothing of the kind," I snapped. "I am glad you had a good time," surprising the way I flopped around where Violet MacDade was concerned. But something about her always got me. I wasn't looking at her. I couldn't. I pretended to be very busy, brushing my hair, warped into the slip at exactly 7 the next morning. Joan Lefebvre hadn't appeared for breakfast, but she was among the first at the gangplank, having come aboard in the middle of the cruise. And from a foreign port, she had to go through certain formalities which the rest of us were spared. Violet helped her wherever possible. This partner of mine seemed able to pull strings almost anywhere, so it wasn't long before the three of us were climbing into the great limousine which Violet called her chariot. The girl was still uncommunicative about her destination. During the ride into Los Angeles, she evinced little interest in what to her must have been a new world. A question or two about hotels, the facilities for finding people, that was all, until we dropped her at the Grayson. "You are detectives," she said suddenly. "Los Angeles is your home. Do you by chance know of," she hesitated, "of a Jonathan Quarles?" "Yeah," said Violet. "But I don't know any good of him. Mealy-mouthed old scout, supposed to be very wealthy. From things I've heard, he ain't always been too ethical about how he got his dough. He's got it, though, which is what counts. I hear he's reformed in the last few years. Belongs to a church and everything. Why do you ask?" The girl seemed disposed not to answer. Violet's chauffeur had deposited the child's pitiful array of luggage on the sidewalk, and there was a porter hovering near. Joan put out her hand to me, blinked back sudden tears as she looked at Violet. "You have been so good to me," she murmured. "So very kind." "I do hate to leave you like this, but—" "Okay, said Violet. "Don't tell us nothing you don't want to. You can find this Jonathan Quarles in the phone book, and me too, if you ever need me." "Let's go, McCloskey," she bawled at the chauffeur, and we rolled away, leaving the girl staring after us. We spent the rest of the morning at the house, unpacking, straightening out the petty tangles occasioned by a 3 months' absence. Violet's lunch was enormous, certain to restore at least 5 pounds of the 50 she had lost. But after it was over, she seemed her old self again. She could hardly wait to get down to the office, busy there with accumulated work. Our office doors carried the names of a score of insurance companies and department stores. It wasn't till well after 3 o'clock that she paused to send out for what she calls a snack. "Just a bite to keep body and soul together till dinner time," she told the boy. "Say a couple of sandwiches, a piece of chocolate pie, and some coffee. And bring the papers back with you," she added. The boy winked, went out grinning. Violet's help was a sore spot with me, but she was adamant whenever I suggested firing some of them. I never saw a slangier, more disrespectful lot in my life. But, as she pointed out, Every last one of them would have died for her. Indeed, some of them had. There was an extra in the batch of papers the boy brought back. Violet, between gulps of scalding coffee, read the headlines aloud. "Jonathan Quarles attacked," she snorted. "Well, what do you know about that?" She munched on a sandwich, seeming to masticate the boxed account of the affair at the same time. I read over her shoulder. A madman, according to the extra, had invaded the sanctum sanctorum of one of the city's greatest financiers. There were several versions of the tale, the most lucid being that of Anne Stimson, the great man's private secretary. This Miss Stimson seemed to be a pretty level-headed young woman. The invader, she said, had really not acted like a madman until nearly the close of his interview with Mr. Quarles. True, he had brushed aside all opposition to his entrance. In the first place, voices from within the library had been raised to a frightful pitch, but the actual attack hadn't occurred until the very last. Jonathan Quarles had sustained various cuts and bruises, was the possessor of a beautiful black eye, but strangely was unable to give any reason for the attack. He didn't know the man, had never seen him before. Mr. Quarles' own description was peculiarly vague. Not so Miss Stimson's. She, the paper hinted that this was against her employer's wishes, described the man in detail. His voice she particularly remembered. It was rough, uncouth. His words were a garbled mixture of bad English and worse French. Did she know the man's name? No, she did not, and most unfortunately he had made good his escape before reinforcements arrived. "Baloney," said Violet elegantly. "Quarles knows more'n he's telling." She paused, struck by sudden thought. "I wonder," she mused, "if our little friend Joan Lefebvre was mixed up in this. Remember the voice of the guy on that schooner? I hadn't known it was a schooner, but I remembered the voice. And I remembered what the voice, at least I presumed it was the voice, had done to Joan Lefebvre, and she had asked us about Jonathan Quarles." Violet nodded her great head as if she had read my mind. She flicked the switch of the inter-office annunciator, grunted, "Get me Miss Joan Lefebvre at the Grayson. Miss Joan Lefebvre at the Grayson," a voice from the box parroted. After a moment, the same voice announced, "Miss Joan Lefebvre is not registered at the Grayson." Violet cursed. Find out if a dame answering this description is registered under any other name. She rattled off a word picture of the girl that astonished even me, but it did no good. Joan Lefebvre had vanished. Violet was disposed to admire the girl's ability to lose herself. To my amazement, I found myself annoyed. Why, I asked myself, should I care if a chance acquaintance chose to avoid me? But I did. Violet did too. "I told you," she grumbled. "I told you there was something funny about the kid." "Just the same," she went on, "I am betting we hear from her." Well, as usual, my elephantine partner was right. We did hear from the girl we knew as Joan Lefebvre, but it wasn't until noon the next day. Not until the late morning editions had blazoned the news of Jonathan Quarles' murder. He had been shot during the night. The coroner's physician placed the time of death at about 12. The servants sleeping in the house had not been disturbed by the shot, had only discovered the body upon arising in the morning. Jonathan's son, Jimmy Quarles, had been out until 3 o'clock, had seen a light in his father's study when he came in, but had assumed the older man to be working and had gone directly to bed. Jimmy, according to the papers, was unable to account for the atrocious crime and was still, according to the papers, prostrated with grief, which, said Violet, is some more baloney. Nobody be prostrated with grief over that old curmudgeon's death. I asked her why she disliked Quarles so. She didn't know, she just didn't like hypocrites. I assumed from this that he must have fallen in that category, but I didn't know why. "The Sun is offering a reward for the killer," I suggested tentatively. "And I see the erudite secretary, Miss Anne Stimson, has advanced the theory that yesterday's so-called madman is the murderer. Eh, said Violet, and he might be at that. Now, assuming that we could use the 10 grand and that the guy with the mixed accent is the same one we heard in the middle of the ocean, and assuming that his voice is what scared hell out of Joan Lefebvre, we had better look for little Joan. Right, said Violet, and it was then that Joan Lefebvre was announced. She came in quietly, stood before Violet's great desk, looking like an embarrassed child. Her dark eyes were still the saddest I had ever seen, but there was no longer that other thing peeping out at me. Her purpose, whatever it may have been, had either been accomplished or abandoned. I have come, she said, because that which I planned, that which I wished to do, is no longer possible. You, of all those aboard that great ship, have befriended me. Therefore, having it in my power to repay you in some slight degree, I have come to do that which I may before I go. Go where? Violet growled. You ain't going nowhere. You are gonna stick around and let Macted and Alvarado show you the sights. Ain't she, Nevada? I said, yes? Yes, of course. That damnable lump was in my throat again. The girl was so little, so forlorn, and Violet, the big lummox, was so very human at times that— Why don't you sit down? I snapped. Don't stand there like a fool, sit down. Joan sat down meekly and Violet guffawed. Don't take it to heart, kid, she said, waggling a huge fist in my direction. Nevada is just talking that way to keep from crying. She's so glad to see you. What's the guy's name that bumped old Moneybags off? Pierre Lefebvre? Said Joan. Then, startled at Violet's seeming omnipotence, how did you know why I came? Just a trick of the trade, said Violet. I can tell you lots of things about yourself. You probably ran away from home, though heaven only knows why anybody'd want to live in Papeete in the first place, and you copped some dough and you were lugging a gun. So why did you kill Jonathan Quarles? I didn't. There was nothing meek about Joan Lefebvre now. She was out of her chair and stamping a tiny foot to emphasize her words. How can you say such a thing? Pierre Lefebvre killed him, I tell you. Okay, I believe you. Can't a guy ask a civil question without you having a tantrum? Joan sat down quite as suddenly as she'd got up. This bozo that scared you stiff out there in the fog, he's this Pierre you were talking about. Well, who is he? Your brother? Your father? Or what? A deep flush crept up beneath the girl's tan. My stepfather, she answered very low. He is the master of the auxiliary schooner Papeete. I did not know he was coming north when he sailed from home. I hoped I would never see him, hear of him again. And then when I heard his terrible voice coming out of the night, he passed out, said Violet sympathetically. Okay, noting the tears in the girl's eyes. You don't have to tell me why you hate him. Not now, anyway. I wouldn't have much trouble hating him myself, but Jupiter, he had a peach of a vocabulary. So the man's name was Pierre Lefebvre, and he was master of the schooner Papeete. But how could we be sure he was the same man who had attacked Quarles? Did Joan know of a motive, and why had she inquired about Quarles herself? I had heard the name, she said, becoming rather vague at this point. I thought possibly I might look him up. And did you? Joan hesitated, evidently decided on at least a certain amount of frankness. I didn't see him, if that is what you mean. I went to his home, but his secretary said he was too busy to see me, so I went away. But while you were there, you heard, or maybe saw your stepfather, this Pierre Lefebvre. No. It was merely that she knew he must have reached port. And later the secretary's description in the papers had tallied closely enough to coincide. And then Quarles had been murdered. There was the reward. Joan would like to see us get that. Violet didn't press her. The story had a lot of loopholes, was weak in spots. For instance, why hadn't she stayed at the Grayson which we had recommended? And what was the real motive for her call on Jonathan Quarles? Or for coming to the United States, for that matter. There was no doubt she hated this Pierre Lefebvre enough to turn him up. And perhaps she had visions of splitting the reward. I said, let's all go over and check up with the admirable secretary, Miss Stimson. I don't know why this Stimson woman bothered me. I didn't know her from Adam's ox. It was just that the newspapers had played her up as such a model of efficiency. I guess a paradigm of all the virtues. Between her and Joan, we ought to be pretty sure whether or not Lefebvre is the man we want. Violet conceded this to be a swell idea. But just in case, she added, I think I'll shoot a couple of the boys down to San Pedro to look the Papite over. Which she did. Jonathan Quarles' mansion was one of those that seemed to go on regardless of a little thing like murder. One got the impression that even the millennium wouldn't interfere with the regular routine. Everything was very quiet and sedate, of course, but the wheels were still humming. The butler didn't know if Miss Stimson could see us. She was very busy with young Mr. Quarles and the family lawyer. Violet said, She'll see me. Tell her, I think I know who killed her boss. Startled, the man went away, came back in a moment to usher us into the middle of what looked like a scene. Having known whom to expect, I easily placed the three occupants of the great room. The lawyer, one could never mistake him for anything else, was well past middle age, important with the assured importance of success, but not in the least pompous. His spatulate fingers toyed idly with a jeweled paper knife, part of the ornate desk set before him. Mo-wise, he was motionless. Not so young Jimmy Quarles. He was pacing the floor nervously, though I wouldn't have said he was bowed down with grief. Rather, he seemed nettled, and just a little stubborn over something that was being discussed when we came in. There were certain telltale marks of dissipation on his good-looking, slightly immature face, but he appeared a harmless sort. One thing I was sure of. He was in love with the beautiful Anne Stimson. Don't ask me how a woman knows those things. She just does. Miss Stimson took charge of the interview. Not that she was officious, merely efficient. She was very lovely, and I could readily see why Jimmy Quarles was that way about her. But, well, I guess I was already prejudiced. She was too self-possessed. Her eyes, when she looked at Jimmy, lacked warmth, and when she turned to Violet, I sensed an unspoken antagonism. You have a clue to the murderer, Violet said. In a way. She had moved to the desk, was admiring the glittering dagger in the lawyer's hands. Anything gaudy was sure to attract Violet. About the reward, now you folks ready to pay it? Miss Stimson and Bigsby, the lawyer, exchanged glances. Bigsby hummed and hawed a little. Well, you see, Miss MacDade, certain matters have come to light that make the amount stated somewhat, prohibitive. In fact, we were intending to withdraw the offer entirely. I wasn't, said Jimmy Quarles. Not the sporting thing to do, course. I didn't know Dad was practically on the rocks, but I made the offer and it stands. At this, Miss Stimson's eyes couldn't be said to lack warmth. They positively shot sparks. You are a fool, Jimmy Quarles. Do you realize what that will leave us? Leave you, under the ridiculous terms of the new will? Do you think you'd... You could see Jimmy was in one of those well-known quandaries. If he didn't pay the reward, he was bound to lose face. And, if he did, he stood to lose. Well, her threat was pretty obvious to me. The lady didn't intend to live on love alone. She whirled on Violet. But you are not sure. You haven't caught the man yet, have you? Nope. And if the reward's all that's worrying you, I won't even try. I'll turn my information over to the cops and forget the whole works. Pure blah. Violet never parted with information free of charge. Your information is pretty conclusive then. Well, said Violet, there are points that need a little clearing up. I kind of thought maybe you and Miss Lefebvre could. Miss who? I thought Bigsby, the lawyer, was going to have a stroke. But he didn't. It did take him a minute or two, however, to regain his composure. Surely you don't mean that this young woman is Joan Lefebvre? Afraid she is, said Violet. So what of Tahiti? Of Tahiti, to be exact. She's from Papeete. Tahiti. Well, well, bless my soul. Mr. Bigsby seemed immensely pleased. He trotted around the desk, extending both hands to the astonished Joan. Congratulations, my dear girl, congratulations. You will share equally with your... Suddenly embarrassed, he flushed hotly, dropped her hands. I mean to say that that Jonathan Quarles has bequeathed you half of the, residue. He mopped his pink forehead with a very large handkerchief. Unfortunately, we find that his affairs were, slightly involved. However, he brightened considerably, you should realize at the very least something like $50,000. Joan's face was very white. She swayed on her feet like a punch-drunk fighter. Violet's mouth hung agape till I thought she would never close it. And well, I'll confess I was a little shaky, but not too far gone to note Miss Stimson's reactions. If ever a face depicted demoniacal fury, hers did. She caught my eye on her, skillfully masked her emotions. So this is the illegitimate child of Jonathan Quarles? Suddenly she was staring at the girl with a new expression. You were here yesterday. That man you sent him to kill your father. Joan fainted. Dropping to her side, I worked on her, conscious of Violet's booming voice beating down the puny arguments of the others. Someone handed me a glass of water. It was Jimmy Quarles, staring down at the girl in my arms. He muttered, "Poor kid," and turned away. I got part of the water down her throat, slapped her once or twice, and finally brought her around. Things had quieted down considerably by the time she was able to sit up. Anne Stimson was once more her regal self. Bigsby, it turned out, was more than pleased that he didn't have to search the South Seas for a missing heiress. Of course, he pointed out, substantiating proof of Joan's identity would have to be forthcoming. Violet agreed to produce it. Jimmy Quarles took little part in the conversation, confined himself to a covert appraisal of Joan. I couldn't tell whether he was pleased with her or not. Probably not, I thought cynically. I knew I wouldn't be overly fond of someone who was getting half of what I'd always considered rightfully mine. Then there was the love angle. If Anne Stimson gave him the heir because he wasn't inheriting enough to, but would she? She was being pretty sweet to him again. Moat she'd decided that half a loaf was better than none. Bigsby said, "Well, that's all settled then. Where can we get in touch with you, miss?" Lefebvre, Miss Quarles, Jimmy corrected. Regardless of this and that, she's my half-sister. She can stay here with us if she likes. And imagine our surprise. Anne Stimson seconded the motion. Joan said, Oh, I couldn't. Not yet. I have enough money to keep me at the hotel for a while. Yeah, said Violet brutally. But whose money is it? You better come home with Nabada and me till we get things straightened out. Which reminds me, how's about catching the murderer? The murderer had somehow slipped our minds. And, strangely enough, no one seemed to care whether he was caught or not. No one, that is, but Violet. Miss Stimson suggested that perhaps the police would solve the crime without our help. Violet doubted it. While they argued the point, Joan and I quietly departed. We picked up her luggage at a third-rate hotel, left the car for Violet, and took a taxi home. No one cared about the murderer. How silly of me. I had forgotten the dear public. Violet didn't come home for dinner. In fact, it was nearly midnight before she arrived, but we had news of her activities through the evening papers under the scarehead, "Quarles' killer known." I read of how MacDade and Alvarado, cooperating with the police, had practically cornered Pierre Lefebvre. His schooner, the Papite, was being kept under surveillance, as if the Nini, reading this, would go back to it, and his arrest was momentarily expected. That wasn't all. Violet had unburdened her soul to the papers. Juan Lefebvre, horrified at her stepfather's crime, had come forward to point the first accusing finger. "Girl, positive of father's guilt," screamed a subhead, and to cap the climax, fears revenge under protection of MacDade and Alvarado. It even gave our home address. Joan didn't enjoy the rest of her meal. Do you suppose he will try to?" "I wouldn't be surprised," I snapped. "Not after that." I resolved that now would be a good time to fill in some of the gaps in the girl's story. "See here, Joan," I said. "I like you and Violet likes you, but after all, you haven't played exactly fair with us. We've got to know, for one thing, why you wanted to see Jonathan Quarles. Did you know he was your father? Did you know he'd mentioned you in his will?" "Tell knew he was my father," she said hesitantly. "But I didn't know about the money. And if I had, it wouldn't have made any difference." I hated him for what he did to my mother, for what he made of me, illegitimate child. She smiled crookedly. "That isn't what they call you in Tahiti." Now, I soothed her. "Times have changed. Things like that are soon forgotten here in the States. I suppose you intended to kill him, melodramatic vengeance from the South Seas and all that sort of thing." "Yes," she said, so quietly that there was no melodrama about it. "I stole one of Lefebvre's guns. I stole some of his money, after all. Part of it belonged to my mother. Hadn't she lived with the beast for years?" "They were really married?" "Oh, yes," she said. There was infinite bitterness in her tone. "Yes, he was her legal husband. I suppose I should have been grateful because he let me, the nameless one, use his name. But there was never any doubt in Papite as to what I really was. But Pierre Lefebvre had never known who she was. The mother had taken care of that. Even the girl hadn't known until after her mother's death. And then, sorting through the pitifully meager store of things that were left, Joan had discovered the truth. Pierre, coming home drunk, had surprised her in the act of running away, had beaten her until she confessed the reason for her going. A few days later, he had sailed. She hadn't known where, until his hated voice crashed out of the fog somewhere along the California coast. I surmised Lefebvre had been intent on blackmail Cleve. In a way, he probably looked up Jonathan Quarles, found he was wealthy now and would doubtless pay well to keep his past a secret. But Quarles hadn't paid, except with his life. Lefebvre was an ugly customer, a man of violent temper when thwarted, according to Joan. She showed me bruises that hadn't healed yet from his last beating. So, you see, Joan had a mighty good reason for hating both of these men. A funny idea occurred to me. I liked the girl, you understand, but just the same. Couldn't she have read of Lefebvre's attack the same as we had? Couldn't she have shot Quarles herself, and, by blaming it on Lefebvre, kill two birds with the one stone? I studied her in repose. Her face was curiously childlike. Her eyes, twin pools of sorrow, were without guile. Nevertheless, the idea in my mind persisted. Detectives like the Chinese are strange people. Violet barged in, cheerful as usual, just as I was going to bed. "Well," she breezed, "how's every little thing?" Giving me no chance to tell her what I thought of her, she ploughed on through to her own rooms, and I could hear the shower going full blast. 5 minutes later, she was back, attired in the rainbow effect she called her lounging pajamas. Through the sheer fabric of her sleeves, I could see the bulge of her guns. I don't believe she ever took them off, even under the shower. "Just a little shrinking, Violet," I said, always doing her best to avoid notoriety. The irony was wasted. She plumped herself down on the bed, grinned at me, her little greenish eyes alight with mischief. "Yeah," she said, "I know what you are going to say. But, you see, our two dicks couldn't get a tumble at Pedro. They found the papite okay, but there was nobody aboard but a couple of natives. Probably old man Lefebvre read the papers yesterday too, and the Stimson woman's description of him was so accurate, he thought he'd better fade. Anyway, he hasn't showed up. He'll most likely show up here," I snapped. "That's what I'm hoping. That's why I spilled all, or nearly all, the details." She scowled at me. "Shrinking, Violet. Nuts to you, Nevada. You don't get nowhere nowadays by shrinking." "Violet," I said, "did it ever occur to you that it might be Joan and not Pierre?" "Sure, it occurred to me. Only I found out from Bigsby that Quarles didn't have her in his will till yesterday. Quarles called the lawyer in and changed the instrument right after Lefebvre escaped. Something must have started the old devil's petrified conscience to working, but the kid couldn't have known that." "No," I admitted. "But the money angle was out anyway. She hated him." I repeated Joan's story, added some of my own theories. Violet looked thoughtful. "Well," she said doubtfully, "maybe you are right. But guilty or innocent, Pierre Lefebvre's gonna be sore as hell when he reads who's accusing him of the murder. Say, what'd you think of young Quarles and the Stimson dame?" "He's a sucker," I said. "His face tells me he's been around, but just the same, he's a sucker for her." "Ah, but is she for him?" "I got an idea she'd marry one of Lefebvre's natives if he had money enough." Which proves that Violet had at least one womanly attribute: intuition. She padded away presently, and I turned out the lights and tried to go to sleep. Eventually, I did sleep. I awoke with the sound of shots ringing in my ears. There may have been more, but I heard only two. A swift pounding of feet echoed down the hall. A door slammed. It sounded like the front one. Fumbling for the light switch, I wasted a few precious seconds, and by the time I had slipped on a robe and got out to the hall, Violet was gone. So was her target. The front door stood open. The sudden roar of a motor racing down the street was followed by another as Violet's big roadster flashed out of the drive. She went by me, doing 50, waved a pudgy fist as if she were just out for an airing. There was blood on the sidewalk at my feet. Great splotches of it made a trail that led from somewhere inside the house to an indeterminate point down the street, probably to where that motor had come to life. I went in, traced the sticky stuff to Joan Lefebvre's room, found her huddled under the covers, shivering as with the ague. But she was unharmed. Having ascertained this much, I shook her into coherency. "That blood might have been Violet's. Snap out of it," I said sharply. "What happened?" "Lefebvre came." She gasped. I woke up with him choking me. I tried to scream, but his fingers only crushed me tighter. His face in the moonlight. It was horrible. And then Violet shot him." "Did he have a gun too?" "I don't know. Wait. I think he did. Yes, he shot at her, and then she shot again, and then he ran." She dissolved into hysterics once more. "Well, All I could do was hope for the best. I gave Joan a stiff shot of sleeping powder, finally got her quieted, closed the door, and started out to mix myself a highball. The hall was full of goggle-eyed neighbors. Bridget, our housekeeper, was regaling them with her version of the shooting, which she couldn't possibly have seen, and interspersing it now and then with tales of gorier affairs she had witnessed while in Violet's service. I said, "Bridget, you look terrible. Better go back to bed before the cops come." She flushed a bright scarlet, disappeared into her own quarters. But the neighbors, I found, were harder to get rid of. It must have been a full 15 minutes before the last of them went. Locking the door behind them, I went out to the kitchen for my postponed highball again. I was interrupted, this time by the arrival of Detectives Lafferty and Berkowitz in a precinct car. "Somebody phoned," said Lafferty. "Said there was a shooting." "Yes," I sighed, "someone always does. But it's all over now, Sergeant. You boys come in and have a drink." They came in. I led the way to the kitchen. Berkowitz, a smallish, weasel-faced dick, downed 3 highballs, one right after the other, without batting an eye. But his mind was still on his work. What was all the ruckus about, he wanted to know. Lot of blood spattered around and we got to make some kind of a report. Sudden cupidity shone in his eyes. "Say, you girls have got that Lefebvre dame here. Was the shooting too?" "Oh, the shooting. I hoped I was properly nonchalant. It wouldn't do to tell them too much and let them chisel in on my reward." "Why, it was really nothing much. Just a common prowler got in, and Violet happened to be awake. She took a couple of shots at him, but he escaped." "Oh, yeah. Let me talk to Mac." Violet MacDade was Mac to every flatfoot in town. I told Berkowitz he should be different and try Miss MacDade for a change. He was not to be sidetracked. "Okay," he said stubbornly. "Mac or Miss MacDade, it's all one to me. I am asking where she is. So what?" And there was Violet herself standing in the doorway. She was breathing heavily, as if laboring under great excitement. "Spill what you've got to say, Weasel, and then get to hell outta here. I am tired." Berkowitz, it appeared, had little more to say. Violet admitted she had chased the wounded man, but claimed to have lost him, and she positively had no clue to his identity. Catching Lafferty's admiring gaze on her pajama-clad figure, she snatched one of Bridget's kitchen aprons and tied it around her middle. There were times when Violet was very modest. "Go on, boys," she cajoled. "On your way, I am practically dead on my feet." As a matter of fact, she was as nervous as a wet hen. For some reason, she considered it terribly important to get those 2 dicks out of the house, immediately. She finally succeeded, and then the storm broke. "For goodness sake, get a doctor," were her first words. "Joan's been stabbed." And after that came a string of curses worthy of even that past master, Pierre Lefebvre. I was petrified. How could Joan have been stabbed? Hadn't I locked the front door? "Sure, you dizzy idiot," and left the window open. Lefebvre came through the window, you nut. Are you going to get that doctor, or are you going to stand there all night with your mouth open? Well, I phoned for the nearest doctor. After that, I kicked myself very thoroughly and went in to see Joan. She was unconscious. A gaping hole in her left side was still welling blood, despite Violet's efforts. The efforts, typical of Violet as a nurse, consisted of piling an armload of towels around and on top of the wound as if she were building a dam. I pushed her aside, managed to staunch the flow, took the girl's pulse, and found it very weak. I hoped the doctor would hurry. And I hoped Violet wouldn't wring my neck for babbling with a couple of half-wit cops while Joan was being attacked the second time. Still, it wasn't entirely my fault. I resolved to strike first. "You let Lefebvre get away," I accused. "Let him lose you and come back to finish the job." Violet turned from the open window, stared at me curiously. "There are times," she grunted, "when I wonder why in hell I ever took you in as a partner. As a dick, you are the last word in fashion models. Here is this poor kid sleeping peaceful, depending on you to take care of her. And what happens?" Her voice rose. "3 dicks in the house, and what happens? Did I say 3 dicks? My mistake. 2 dicks and a... Mercifully, the doctor came. The bell gave me a good excuse to leave, pretending I hadn't heard what she called me. Dr. Gorham, after 5 long minutes, with Joan, stood up, closed his bag briskly. He was brisk about everything. "She'll do," he said. "She'll do nicely. Lost a lot of blood, of course. Knife just missed her heart, but she'll pull through. Have to have a nurse, though, maybe 2. I'll send one over from the hospital right away, and tomorrow we'll see." He nodded briskly, took himself off. Violet, still in her ridiculous pajamas and Bridget's apron, was pottering about the window again. I heard her curse, suddenly looked up to see her squeezing through it. "So that's how you got in," I said. I knew I locked the door. Something about barn doors and stolen horses drifted up from the lawn below the window. Her tousled head popped into sight. "Get me a flashlight or some matches, Mex," I said. "Do not call me Mex." But I got her the light. She scrawled back a moment later, wheezing gustily. Between a fat thumb and forefinger was something that glowed redly. A ruby, I supposed, from one of her many rings. She was always losing something or other. "How about getting some coffee, Mex, and a little snack? I gotta get dressed." She waddled through the connecting door into her rooms. "You better get dressed too," she bellowed. "Put the coffee on first, though. We got a lot of work to do before the night's over." I made coffee. And fried bacon and eggs. I could have got Bridget out of bed, but as long as Violet seemed willing to let bygones be bygones, I thought I'd humor her. She came out, sniffing greedily. "You are not such a bag egg, Nevada," she admitted. "Neither are these," she added, attacking the 3 on her plate. "So now look, I am going to tell you something. When that nurse gets here, you watch her plenty careful. See if she knows her business, and keep your eyes open in case anybody else shows up. Stay in Joan's room and keep your eyes open. Don't worry. Sweet Violet, little Nevada took it on the chin once tonight. It won't happen again." Again, I caught that curious expression in her eyes. "Listen, Violet," I said. "Have you definitely made up your mind it wasn't Joan who killed Quarles? After all, these attacks on her don't prove that she didn't kill him. You yourself said Lefebvre would try to wreak vengeance, guilty or innocent." "Joan did not kill Quarles," she stated flatly. "I'm surprised at you being so suspicious. I kind of thought you liked the kid. Besides, I checked with headquarters on the slud they took out of Quarles, and it couldn't have come from that old horse pistol I found in her stateroom." "But she could have got another gun." The great lummox rose, wiped her mouth on a dish towel. "Okay," she said. "You play it that way if you want to, and I'll play it mine. Which reminds me, I gotta beat it down to headquarters again. Remember, keep your eyes open." She waddled down the hall, and I helped her on with her coat. The morning rather, for it was after 2 o'clock, had turned cold, and Violet evidently intended to use the roadster, which she left at the curb. She went down the steps, was just easing behind the wheel when another car, a small coupe, pulled up beside her. Et was the nurse. I could see the starched white uniform in the glow of the dashlight. Violet talked with her a moment, then gunned the roadster into life and shot away down the street. The nurse's name was Miss Hanson. I'd be willing to bet it is still Miss Hanson. A grimmer visage I never saw, and her manner was as starchy as her uniform. But I had to admit, she was efficient. In an hour, Joan's room looked like a first-class hospital ward. And, which was more important, Joan had roused from her coma and was able to talk a little. She couldn't remember much of the second attack. The sleeping potion I'd given her had, mercifully or not, depending on the way you look at it, stupefied her, so she was barely conscious of the knife thrust. And her assailant was but a vague, blurred shape. Joan thought she'd felt fingers clawing at her throat before the blade struck home. She wasn't sure. Anyway, I fainted again or something. She smiled wanly. Seems like I am always fainting, doesn't it, Miss Alvarado, Nevada, to you, I said. I felt like, well, like what Violet had called me, for thinking evil of the little devil, a murderer. Not Joan. Maybe she'd have killed Quarles, but if she had, she'd have taken her medicine. Of that, I was sure. Because she smiled at me so apologetically. Well, perhaps Lefebvre, she asked. Has he been caught? I don't think so, I said, but he will be, never fear. When Violet shoots anybody, a doctor is indicated, he'll have to get medical attention. The doctor will report in, and then the doorbell rang. Disregarding Violet's silly admonition to watch the nurse, I went to answer it, but before opening the door, I removed my little gun from its holster just above the knee and held it ready. For what? It was Jimmy Quarles and Ann Stimson. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Jimmy was carrying a florist's box and looking slightly flustered. Miss Stimson was, as usual, beautiful and completely at ease. Well, I invited them in. There was nothing else to do. Miss, MacDade phoned me, Jimmy said, seeing my blank look. Miss Lay, my sister, is she conscious yet? Yes, I said shortly. I felt like adding, but you aren't. Couldn't the fellow go anywhere without the Stimson woman tagging along? And suddenly I knew why I didn't like her. It was because I liked him. In other words, and as idiotic as it sounds, I was jealous. Do let me take your things, I said cordially. I am sure Joan will be glad to see you both if she's awake. Ann Stimson kept her coat on, said they were only going to stay a moment. Has the girl been able to talk much? Does she know who stabbed her? Who could it have been but her stepfather, Pierre Lefebvre? Not that she saw him the last time. I'd given her a sedative, which practically drugged her into insensibility. But things may become clearer as she gets stronger. Let's hope so, said Jimmy, leading the way to Joan's room. I wondered again if Jimmy Quarles really liked his newfound sister. She was only his half-sister at most, and a lot of our best people would have considered her, charitably, of course, something less than that. Maybe the flowers were a tribute to the $50,000 he wouldn't get, now that she was going to live. At that, another curious thought took possession of my devious mind. What price Mr. Jimmy Quarles is the knife wielder? After all, we had no proof that Lefebvre had returned. Jimmy stood to make 50 grand by the girl's death, and there was always the elusive Pierre to blame it on. I found myself clutching the doorknob and staring at Jimmy's handsome, dissipated face as if, "Bosh," I said, and opened the door. Joan was asleep. The militant Miss Hanson held a cautioning finger to her lips, glared ferociously. We tiptoed in and gathered about the bedside. Jimmy rather awkwardly extended the box of flowers to the nurse, who seemed disposed to refuse, but finally changed her mind and went off down the hall with it. And there I was back, thinking of him as a would-be murderer. Chairbait, but for the will of heaven and a certain inexpertness with a knife. Had Violet thought of him as the second assailant? Might she not be even now pinning the deed on his curly head? Ha! So that was why she'd notified him of his sister's condition. She wanted to get him out of his house so she could prowl it. Had probably suggested that he bring Miss Stimpson along. Thinking of Violet, I thought of her last words. Keep your eyes open. Well, they'd been open, but they damn near missed something that was taking place. Anne Stimpson was just turning from the array of bottles on the bed table. It was the clink of one bottle against another that brought me to life. I caught the woman's wrist, flipped up my gun, and jammed it into her side. Hard. Open your hand, I said. Open it, or I'll put a slug right through your girdle. Jimmy the fool grabbed me. Oh, I say now, he must have thought I was clowning. Little girls mustn't play naughty, Papa spank. He slapped my wrist playfully. And that did the trick. My gun leaped in my hand. I saw Anne Stimpson at the door stagger. Her right hand was in the pocket of her coat, and the pocket suddenly belched flame. She missed me. It seemed like her gun made an awful lot of noise. And then, as she started to fall, I saw Violet coming down the hall behind her. It had been Violet's gun, not Anne's, which made most of the noise. Violet didn't bother to step over Miss Stimpson. She stepped on her. "Dirty sneak," she snarled. Jimmy, his face a pasty white, came out of his daze. "Oh, no," he protested. "Not Anne. You had no right to shoot her like that." Sudden fury attacked him. "You lured us here. You deliberately trapped us. But why, in heaven's name, why? What did we ever do to you?" "Shush," Violet admonished him. Ridiculously, you must admit, considering that she'd probably waked the whole neighborhood again with her cannons. "This is a sick room." She strode forward, clutched him by the shoulders. "Listen to me, Jimmy boy. The woman had it coming to her, Nevada. And I don't just go around shooting people for fun. Look at the bottle your innocent little Anne's got in her dead fist. See them skulls and crossbones, know what they mean. They mean she was doping your sister's medicine, so she wouldn't be able to talk to tell who really knifed her. And you know why she was afraid of what Joan would tell. Because I called you up and planted the idea." "But why? Why should Anne have?" "Use your head, boy. Hasn't the woman been stalling you along because you were broke?" "Sure she has. And when this tough guy, Lefebvre, comes along and makes a fuss, don't she think it's a swell time to bump your old man?" "You are damn right she does. She killed my father. Tell me, she used the same gun she's got right now. Because why? Because you never had one. I made it my business to find out, but when the new will pops up, you are left with hardly chicken feed. So little Anne has to get rid of Joan to make marrying you worthwhile." The nurse was dourly ministering to Joan. Bridget, horrible in a flannelette bathrobe, was gawking in the doorway. And the neighbors, I knew they'd be around, were doing their best to tear the house apart, but the police hadn't arrived as yet. Jimmy persisted in his unbelief. "But aside from the poison bottle, where is your proof?" From one of her voluminous pockets, Violet produced a dagger. A very fancy jeweled dagger it was, and I recognized it as part of the ornate desk set in the Quoz library. "This little sticker," she said, "belongs in your house." So what was one of the jewels doing outside Joan's window? I've got to admit, I wasn't sure the stone came out of your knife,
But I thought I'd give the idea a whirl, and that's another reason why I wanted you here, so I could prowl your dump." "But Lefebvre," I gasped. I remembered quite suddenly the curious way Violet had stared at me. "Before you found the stone, you knew it wasn't Lefebvre." "Sure," she said. "He was plumb dead when I caught up to him. He was in one of those rent cars, and the upholstery was sure a mess. No wonder their rates are high. And I suppose you left him right where you found him." "Nope." I stuffed him in my rumble seat. "I was gonna take him down to the morgue, but I had to get some clothes on first, and then, finding the kid stabbed and all in the house full of dicks, I kinda forgot him." Joan was holding one of Jimmy's roses. Goodness only knows where he'd got them at that time of night, but there they were. He looked pretty sick. Disillusioned is too weak a word, but it'll have to do. He came to the foot of her bed, smiled a rather cynical little smile. "Well, sis," he said, "I guess that leaves just you and me, eh?" And Violet said, "Hell's bells, Bridget, ain't we got nothing to eat in the house?" Nevada claims, "I am shrinking." End of Shrinking Violet by Cleve F. Adams.